Not really. I'm not so concerned about safety issues. I think we're good.
They had these puff things that like puffed us to see if there was any metal. And then we went through this metal detector, and that made me like feel really safe because if anyone were going up the Statue of Liberty, they would have found that they had something. So, yeah.
It made you feel safe.
Yeah.
No, I feel completely safe. I know that there was a terrorist attack here, and but you can't think about those all the time, I don't think.
I am not concerned about catastrophic injury.
Okay, or terrorist stuff, that kind of thing.
No, I don't even think about terrorism.
We've been staying at a hotel down near the World Trade Center site, and going by there every day, I mean, you just think about the lives of those people that died, but it was just such a, I wouldn't say one-time event, but just it probably won't happen again.
Dangers, concerns about city life? No.
Well, yeah, actually I feel very safe, yes.
Are there any dangers about city life that you think of that you don't like?
In Albuquerque?
Yes.
I don't think so.
I would say no, and I was here in 9/11. I think you have to, live without fear.
Is it safe?
Very.
Very safe.
I feel very safe in New York City whenever I come in.
Safe. I haven't feared for anything so far.
Are there concerns or dangers that you feel on a regular basis living in the city?
Not really. I feel pretty secure in Washington.
And I'm not afraid. I don't feel fear in the city.
I'm concerned about the safety in the cities, but for multiple causes. I think the inner city is very unsafe, and we've helped create this. The inner cities are, it's a war zone, and the more government's involved, we have more laws against drugs and guns and everything else, and yet there's more killing going on. At the same time, we still have threat of terrorist attacks. Most people feel like what we've been doing these last few years have made us safe, but quite frankly, I don't feel a lot safer from the potential terrorist attacks than we had before. I think we're every bit in as much danger.
It's a question often heard, how ripe are we? What is the possibility of having a major disaster or catastrophic disaster within a high-density urban populated area? And if you look at it holistically, and I'll explain what I mean by that, it's very high. Because when you talk about all hazards, you talk about everything that goes from a natural disaster event, a technological event, to a terrorist event.
I think a sober assessment must conclude that American cities are indeed in the crosshairs for nuclear terrorists.
The worst of all scenarios is that terrorists would get hold of a improvised nuclear device and actually have a multi-kiloton release in a high-density area.
Cities are at greater risk than rural areas, because in a rural area, a bomb wouldn't actually succeed in killing very many people.
If we look at Al-Qaeda these days, and you look at statements that have come out of people who claim they are spokespeople for Al-Qaeda, they have calculated how many Arabs have died as a result, directly or indirectly, of American policy, they say. And they could easily kill millions of Americans and not have even the score.
They've even stated that their objective is to kill 4 million Americans, including 2 million children.
You're talking about nuclear. Actually, the probability of a major nuclear war is very much reduced. But the probability of a nuclear attack is very much increased because now we have a whole lot more people who have nuclear weapons. Before it was only us and the Soviets.
Having seen 9/11, where a determined adversary killed 3,000 Americans, converting airliners to cruise missiles to attack skyscrapers in what was an impressive organizational feat. This actor having declared that they're serious about trumping 9/11, you do your little calculations about what's greater than 9/11, and if you have an objective to kill 4 million people, I would say the top of that pyramid is a mushroom cloud enveloping a city.
I think if there were a detonation in an American city tomorrow, and the city was not Washington, so we could have hearings on this, and you asked some experts, where do you think the material came from, before there was any effort at technically sorting out the forensics of it for attributing the material, I think they'd say probably Russia or Pakistan. It's not that there isn't fissile material elsewhere, but those are, for a variety of reasons, would be the first two countries virtually all of us would name.
In fact, I sat in a hotel room in Vienna, Austria, just at the time that the 3 hostages were released in Belgrade. And there were, 6 or 8 of us there, and the Russians were there, and we were developing a framework agreement for settling the Kosovo conflict. And one of the Russians with whom I've become good friends, Vladimir Lukin, who was ambassador here and the chair of their International Relations Committee, he sat in this hotel room, little short fellow with short arms, with his arms folded looking at the ceiling for about 2 days. He was very angry. He said, "You spit on us, now why should we help you?" Because the United States had kind of pushed Russia away, and then they were very poor. Now they're very rich with all this oil. He said, "We're the big guys now, we don't really need you." So that was why his observation, "You spit on us, now why should we help you?" But then he said, if we really wanted to hurt you, in fact, I sat in a hotel room in Vienna, Austria, just at the time that the 3 hostages were released in Belgrade. And there were, 6 or 8 of us there, and the Russians were there, and we were developing a framework agreement for settling the Kosovo conflict. And one of the Russians with whom I've become good friends, Vladimir Lukin, who was ambassador here and the chair of their International Relations Committee, he sat in this hotel room, little short fellow with short arms, with his arms folded looking at the ceiling for about 2 days. He was very angry. He said, "You spit on us, now why should we help you?" Because the United States had kind of pushed Russia away, and then they were very poor. Now they're very rich with all this oil. He said, "Gee, we're the big guys now, we don't really need you." So that was why his observation, "You spit on us, now why should we help you?" But then he said, if we really wanted to hurt you, with no fear of retaliation, we'd launch an SLBM, we'd detonate a nuclear weapon high above your country, and shut down your power grid and your communications for 6 months or so. And then Alexander Shabanov, the 3rd-ranking communist, was one of the Russians that was there, a tall, handsome, blonde fellow. And he smiled and said, "And if one weapon wouldn't do it, we have some spares, like about 10,000. It was a very interesting exchange.
I guess the next objection is, well, nobody would really want to kill hundreds of thousands of people. And it is kind of an amazing thing that somebody might want to do that. And then you look at the videotape of Osama bin Laden describing the 9/11 attack and see how thrilled he is by having succeeded in killing 3,000 people, and ask whether he would have been happier if he had killed 300,000. I don't think you can look at the evidence and not say, yes, he would. So he's serious about this.
On my shelf, I have a bunch of really good books that were written 15, 20 years ago about terrorism. Terrorism has been with us for a long time, and these were good books. I mean, they probably still are good books, but they're no longer really adequate to describe the phenomenon that we are really referring to when we talk about terrorism or international terrorism these days. It was true that part of the definition of terrorism was violence conducted to produce a political effect. and that if the violence was of a nature that caused sympathy for the victims, then it wasn't the political effect that the perpetrator wished. And so they want a lot of people watching, but not a lot of people dead, was the old phrase to describe terrorism. The terrorists these days are different. They look to weapons of mass destruction to give them an impact, and they believe they are justified.
Is this in some sense, obscene or even insane objective? Yes, it is. But is history replete with people that had objectives to kill, maybe even everybody or every Jew? Yes, they did. Okay, so it was hard to believe, and it was hard to believe. It's still hard to believe, but it's a fact. Okay? Finally, some people say, well, but in any case, if they got a bomb, they couldn't bring it to the U.S. As one of my former colleagues says, if you have any doubt about the ability of terrorists to bring a nuclear bomb to an American city, remember they could always hide it in a bale of marijuana, which we know comes to American cities. So how does a bale of marijuana come to a city? Answer, well, let me count the ways. Okay, so comes across the border from Mexico, comes across the border from Canada, comes in small airplanes, comes in small boats. So there's a large number of ways in which illegal things get to American cities every day. Those would be precisely the same ways in which terrorists could bring a nuclear bomb.
When one thinks about the destruction from a nuclear weapon, one has to think about the number of variables that go into that calculation. It's a very depressing business, but one starts with the yield of the weapon. The kind of device that we think about typically that may be manufactured by a group of terrorists with highly enriched uranium is a device that would, or could at least, produce the kind of yield that was produced by the first atomic bomb dropped on a city. That was the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, and that had a yield, it varies in estimates, but around 12 kilotons, or approximately 12,000 tons of TNT equivalent. It is possible that the yield could be higher. The second bomb we dropped had a plutonium core, it was a different design, an implosion system, and that had a yield of over 15 kilotons.
So in the introduction of the book, I then asked, imagine that bomb had been put in the back of a van, like the van that was used by Mr. Yosef to blow up the World Trade Center the first time, or to try to, in 1993, and was driven into Times Square and exploded in the middle of a workday. What would happen? So this was about a 10 kiloton bomb. So the size of that blast is slightly smaller than the Hiroshima bomb that the Americans dropped on the Japanese at Hiroshima. So a 10 kiloton bomb from ground zero, everything out to about a third of a mile is vaporized instantaneously in a ball of fire, this release of energy that reaches about 540,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So things just simply disappear. In the sudden death, you would count about 500,000 people in New York because of their concentration. And another 500,000 people could die over the week or two that followed from the extension of the fires, the collapse of buildings, the radioactivity, and the radioactive plume, depending on the directions in which it went. In this nuclear terrorism book, in conjunction with it, we put up a website. It's called nuclearterrorism.org, and you can put in your own zip code and see what Dragonfire's bomb would do in Boston or Detroit or Los Angeles or any city in the U.S.
How does the United States of America handle the detonation of a nuclear weapon in an American city? What is the scenario? We saw what Katrina could do to us, which is, of course, a cakewalk compared to what we're talking about. We also have to recognize that if we can imagine this happening in an American city, we should be able to imagine this happening in 2 or 3 American cities. What kind of response could we mount? It would have to be at the federal level. Local levels, clearly not, or state level is not going to be up to this. I don't think we are in the right universe yet in our ability to handle the consequences of a nuclear detonation in an American city, much less 2 or 3.
So it would be an event unlike any event Americans or even anybody has experienced before. When one tries to play out the consequences of this after you get through the first round of just death and destruction and overload of all capacities for fire and police and emergency medical, the people who were the casualties who weren't killed trying to be treated would just instantly overload any systems that any local community could conceivably have for trying to deal with it.
When I talk about this subject, which I do intermittently to experts in the field, I hear a lot about the implausibility of this. And I would like to be persuaded of that myself. I would relax a bit more, but I'm not. I would really want to underline that the situation is not going to get better anytime soon.
Unfortunately, in the period since 2004, most of the trend lines remain constant. And on those trend lines, I think this will certainly happen at some point, and I think even more likely than not before 2014, and maybe tomorrow, maybe today. I'd say that a second category of threat that's a serious threat, and part of the, I'd say there are two weapons of mass destruction, that is, things that can suddenly destroy tens and hundreds of thousands of lives. Nuclear is the top of this agenda, but biological weapons are also weapons of mass destruction.
Biological weapons are living microorganisms that cause disease. They can be viruses, bacteria, or rickettsia. They infect the host and cause illness, or which may be either incapacitating or fatal. Biological agents have an incubation period between the point of infection till the time when the bacterium or virus has replicated in the host and produced illness and death. And that incubation period can last anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, for example, in the case of smallpox.
Biological weapons today are really the cheap man's bomb. One thing we have to understand is that they can be highly effective. We know that the events post 9/11 would lead some to believe, well, it's only just a few cases and a few deaths. That was really what I would call, at the very best, just a warning shot. It wasn't really the full impact. Today we know that using those same kinds of spores that were sent by letters Biological weapons today are really the cheap man's bomb. One thing we have to understand is that they can be highly effective. We know that the events post 9/11 would lead some to believe, well, it's only just a few cases and a few deaths. That was really what I would call, at the very best, just a warning shot. It wasn't really the full impact. Today we know that using those same kinds of spores that were sent by letters in 2001, if delivered by a very commonly used agricultural spray plane over a larger metropolitan area, would have resulted in potentially many, many thousands of deaths. So that, first of all, you have to understand that it's something within the means of many, many different groups, organizations, or individuals. The perpetrators of this event may very well range from some organized right-wing, left-wing extremist group from somewhere in the world, or it may be a scientist gone astray who has just decided that they want to take the expertise that they have and attempt to see what they can do with it. We need look no further than just the post 9/11 events with anthrax, for which many of us do believe it was a scientist from our own government research establishment that actually perpetrated that event.
So we saw in the case in fall of 2001, 10 grams of dried, highly refined anthrax spores delivered in 7 letters and caused 5 deaths, but enormous disruption and economic damage, really disproportionate, because there's something about biological weapons that people find extremely terrifying. I think it feeds into our deepest psychological fears.
You know, I wrote a book that was published on 9/11 of 2000, Living Terrors, in which I tried to make the case that the real impact for a biologic weapon was only in part due to the number of people that it killed or made sick, but that it was also that fear and panic. And I must tell you, the events of 9/11 surely supported that. When you looked at the idea of 22 cases, 5 deaths from Bacillus anthracis infection related to letters being sent in this country, it almost brought down the U.S. Postal Service. Now, find me one other disease out there for which 22 cases and 5 deaths would have basically put that institution in jeopardy. And so there are few things in this world that can bring a population to its knees than that of some mystery infectious disease.
The situation with biological agents is very scenario dependent. It depends on the type of agent that's used, for example, whether it is contagious or non-contagious, the amount that is delivered, and the means of delivery. So all of those factors will influence the impact of an attack. For example, terrorists might contaminate food or water supplies, or they could deliver an agent as an airborne aerosol, suspension of microscopic particles that would then be inhaled. And that, depending on the quantity of agent and its robustness, could extend over a very large area.
You want to obviously go after humans, and in that sense, where is the biggest and most effective target? It's cities. So I would absolutely support the concept that if I'm going to go after a large number of humans, I'm going to get something that goes into the air, it spreads large distances, and in those large distances are lots of people. That's your metropolitan areas. The agents that we worry about today really are the agents we worried about 10 years ago. And the reason that that's the case is that they were chosen both for concern but also for some of the research that was done 30 and 40 years ago by the bioweaponeers of the various state-sponsored programs because A, they are disseminated quickly in the environment, B, they can survive in the environment, or C, they do a very good job of killing people, and in some instances they actually are not amenable to treatment.
The greatest near-term threat is anthrax, and for a number of reasons. This is a highly virulent agent. There is a treatment, an antibiotic treatment. However, one has to treat individuals within 24 to 36 hours after exposure to save them. After that point, the bacteria multiply in the host, release a toxin into the bloodstream that shuts down organ systems and results in death. So it's a extremely dangerous organism. And also, it is naturally rugged. It forms a spore, which is, under certain conditions, that is a seed-like version of the organism. The normal organism is a rod or a bacillus, but under certain conditions, it will be induced to basically collapse in on itself, form a type of seed with a tough outer coating that protects it from the elements. And this is the natural way that the organism survives in nature under harsh environmental conditions, lack of nutrients or water, and it can survive in soil for decades. The fact that the organism is spore forming means that it can be dispersed in this form through the air and will survive environmental insults, for example, ultraviolet radiation, for much longer than a natural non-spore forming bacteria. So this natural characteristic of anthrax makes it a particularly effective biological weapon, not only because it is so deadly, but also because it is extremely rugged and can be dispersed through the air as an aerosol to infect large numbers of people.
When I published my book in 2000, I actually detailed how one could take off-the-shelf materials in the world of aerosol particle technology, the things that create the wonderful aromas and perfumes in the air that you and I never quite know where they're coming from when we walk through the department store, or the devices that are used to effectively lay down pesticides or other kinds of chemicals in our agricultural fields, and how you could use those tools for nefarious purposes and effectively make the kind of sprays that are invisible to the eye or even to the nose, but not invisible to the lungs and to the bloodstream when those infectious agents get in there. And several people actually challenged the notion that you could do this, and I have to say, fortunately or unfortunately, however you look at it, they went out and actually looked to see, could I buy some of this stuff off the street and do it? And they found they could. That, we use aerosol particle technology, that ability to make these very, very fine type of particles that float literally in the air, just like perfume does. And we use those for all the wonderful good things about our society, how we make certain electrical circuits and how we deliver medicines and so forth. But the ability to just flip the switch a little bit and make it into something that could, literally as a box, be put on a wall, obscured to the masses, and for a 24-hour period deliver a highly effective dose to a large area of an infectious agent is real. And so today, we don't want us to be paranoid about these devices, but we have to understand that you don't have to have a major government research program to figure out how to deliver something. The bullet and gun combination are there, and our job is going to be hopefully knowing enough so that we can detect those kinds of bullet gun combinations should they occur quickly, but knowing that we have to be prepared to detect them.
And then at the end of that line would be something like smallpox, which is largely eradicated, but which, if replicated by some inventive biotech guy and released because it's infectious, could have a huge impact.
During the 1960s and 70s, there was a global campaign to eradicate smallpox, which was the most devastating infectious disease known to human history, through a global vaccination campaign coordinated by the World Health Organization. And this was a remarkable effort involving hundreds of thousands of people in countries such as India and various parts of the African continent and Asia. And it took about 11 years from the start of the program in the late 60s until the disease was finally eradicated from nature in 1977. The Soviet Union at the time played a very key role in this eradication campaign by producing the lion's share of the vaccine that was used around the world to eradicate the disease. At the same time, however, the Soviet Ministry of Defense was secretly developing The Soviet Union at the time played a very key role in this eradication campaign by producing the lion's share of the vaccine that was used around the world to eradicate the disease. At the same time, however, the Soviet Ministry of Defense was secretly developing the smallpox virus as a biological weapon, and they obtained a highly virulent strain of the disease, cultivated it, stockpiled it at a facility outside of Moscow called the Center of Virology in Zagorsk, today's Sergei Posad. And then there was an effort later in the 1980s to develop more sophisticated production methods at the Vector Laboratory in Koltsovo outside of Novosibirsk. Ironically, the Vector Laboratory today is one of the official repositories of the smallpox virus, authorized by the World Health Organization to do defensive work. But the fact that this laboratory was implicated in the biological warfare program with smallpox raises a lot of concerns. So this was, I think, widely considered to be a terrible betrayal of the global eradication campaign, the fact that the Soviet Union was secretly developing smallpox as a weapon. It's unclear the extent to which the public health effort on the positive side was coordinated with the nefarious biological warfare effort by the Ministry of Defense. It's possible that these two efforts were going on in parallel without any coordination, but a more cynical interpretation was that the Soviet military knew that once the disease was eradicated from the human species, it would become that much more deadly as a biological weapon because people would no longer be vaccinated against it and hence would be much more vulnerable.
There's an interesting argument as to why they haven't had a smallpox attack. And I heard an interesting argument as to why not. It's because we're not adequately prepared. And it would come back to bite them. we would lose millions and millions of people. In fact, there was one little tabletop exercise, a war game, if you will, and it was called Dark Winter, I think, and it spread to most of our states in 14 countries around the world before they finally brought it under control.
There are still military microbiological facilities in Russia ostensibly involved in biodefense research that are top secret and closed to Western visitors. And the fact that there is no transparency about these facilities is very concerning and raises suspicions on the part of Western officials that there may be illicit offensive activities still ongoing at these facilities.
One of the things that make biologic agents difficult in terms of trying to control either their movement or their proliferation is the fact that, unlike bullets or bombs or even chemical materials, I can start out with just literally the amount of material on the head of a pin and transport that anywhere in the world and then grow it up wherever I get. So I don't have to have this voluminous material on my possession. I don't have to ship it. I literally can walk through any airport security today with an ink pen, and the material is contained inside it. Nobody detect it, pick it up. And then when I get to the place where I want to either use it or do more work with it, I can then grow up the material I need. And that's what makes us tough. It's not like almost all other weapons where the size by itself defines where you can take it or how you can use it. And that's one of the challenges of using biologic agents. After 35 years of trying to understand Mother Nature, I feel like I have a better sense of what she might do. The problem with terrorism is it's Mother Nature times a perpetrator. And it's the mind and it's the capability of a perpetrator that none of us really understand or know. So in my best professional judgment, would I say we're likely to see more biological terrorism events around the world? Absolutely. Will they be the kind of events that could bring a country to its knees? Surely possible, but I don't know. But in this business, I never forget a phrase that the Irish Republican Army has used for many years as its motto. You have to be lucky all the time. We have to be lucky just once. And when you think about that and you understand the implications of not being prepared, not being able to respond effectively, to me, we have to assume it's going to happen.
We've spent a huge amount of money since September 11th on biodefense programs. There has been a proliferation of high containment laboratories working on biodefense problems. But to some extent, this is counterproductive. So we have a lot more facilities and people who are now working with the most dangerous pathogens, and there is the risk of an accident, or perhaps some of those scientists, there may be a few bad eggs among them, that could actually be either sympathetic to a terrorist group or have personal reasons for developing biological weapons.
I don't worry so much that today you could just go and buy it on the internet, like off a Craigslist or an eBay. But surely we have a very large number of research laboratories around the world that are actually doing very, very wonderful work on these agents, and therefore means that the agents exist in those laboratories. When I say wonderful, I mean these are people who are doing the very best in science enterprise. They are trying to find solutions to these infections and understanding these bugs. But also remember that every time a laboratory works with one of these agents, it's just one more opportunity for somebody with a loose screw, somebody who has this nefarious side to their soul that wants to wreak havoc on the population that might get access to it.
And there are now automated machines that can produce very large DNA sequences, including the entire genome of a virus. And this has already been done for 3 viruses, where the virus itself has been synthesized in the laboratory from off-the-shelf chemicals and produced an infectious organism, which was then capable of causing disease in laboratory animals. It's been done for poliovirus, it's been done for a bacteriophage, which is a virus that infects bacteria, and it's been done for the 1918 strain of the influenza virus, which caused a global pandemic in 1918-1919 that killed an estimated 40 million people. That was an extinct virus, It has been recreated in the laboratory, and scientists are now studying how that virus produced such a devastating illness.
3 times in the pre-century, we had pandemics of influenza. Of the 3, the far and away the most serious was 1918, when there was an enormous loss of life in the United States and around the world. We had 2 others, one in 1957 and one in 1968, that were much more mild by comparison, but nevertheless large numbers of people were infected in the United States and elsewhere in the world. For our planning purposes, we think about 1918, possibly not as the worst case, but certainly a terrible case. And we've tried to do our planning on the presumption that we might see something at least as severe as that. If a pandemic does arise and it's less severe than that, then we're lucky and we'll be that much better prepared to deal with it. Because this is a disease that's spread person to person, it's communicable. The greater the likelihood of close contact with other individuals, the greater likelihood of either becoming infected or, if you are infected, passing it on. So other things being equal, a more densely populated area is at greater risk and therefore have greater consequences than a less densely populated area.
There's this great similarity between bioterrorist attacks and pandemics caused by nature. So the Ebola virus, or even bird flu, which is not a bioterrorist attack, it's just even influenza in an earlier stage, is just part of nature's cocktail for human beings, has many of the same attributes as a bioterrorist attack.
As much as we've done to get better prepared, and we have, with particularly our strategic national stockpile for certain antibiotics, certain drugs, we have to understand in the last 10 years we've watched our healthcare system be gnawed to the bone and we're sucking calcium. So we have less preparedness capability today from a local medical response standpoint than we did even 10 years ago.
The capacity to respond and to deal out of a normal paradigm is very challenging for this country because we seem to be reactive instead of being the capacity to respond and to deal out of a normal paradigm is very challenging for this country because we seem to be reactive instead of being diligent in our planning and plussing up issues before the event. If you could think of a flu epidemic hitting this country and look at the beds available throughout our hospital system and the transportation capabilities and the plans in place, we're greatly challenged.
We have a long way to go before we could declare that we're prepared. And I don't know that I would ever declare that we're fully prepared given the uncertainties of influenza and not knowing what the pandemic virus actually might look like.
Clearly, any major event in a community, an aerosol release of an agent that impacts thousands of people, will overwhelm the healthcare system within minutes. The major question is going to be is how well can we bring in resources from throughout the rest of the country to help out? And then the concern is if they did it in City A, could they do it in City B and C and D, kind of we call a reload phenomena, and would that then really stretch us quickly? We think about this a lot when we deal with the issue of pandemic influenza. When we're preparing for that, we have to think about a pandemic that would bring illness to this country and impact many of the cities about the same time. So there's some parallels here. And we have to understand if we get beyond a one metropolitan area hit, we have exhausted the resources that we've built up. As somebody who has spent the last 35 years in public health, I know enough to know that a biologic terrorism event of any magnitude, should it occur again in the next 10 years, will create absolute chaos and panic in this country. The economic implications are going to be huge, whether there are 10 deaths or 1,000 deaths or 10,000 deaths.
In the case of an attack with a biological weapon, I think that the probability of martial law would be very real. People are going to panic. And as you saw what happened in New Orleans, you know, they were pilfering all those stores and so forth. Society has kind of come unglued, and I think that a rational and maybe necessary response on the part of the government is martial law.
There are some circumstances we look at that we strategize and work scenarios on that are very problematic. And because we have not had these types of major issues, we don't know exactly how everyone would react. I think a pandemic is very problematic, because if there's a problematic pandemic that erupts in a community, there's going to be an attempt to try not to have that scatter throughout the United States. So you have to deal with, can we quarantine that area? It's a very problematic and dicey problem. But, you know, there are plans in place that would say we really need to try to contain this viral disease.
We do have to realize that there will be many questions about what to do and how to do that we haven't answered yet. Is it safe to go back into a city or stay in a city where we've just had a major release of Bacillus anthracis spores? We now know, after the 9/11 anthrax events, that the Hart building wasn't safe, even with one letter having been delivered and the aerosol of those spores getting into the heating and cooling system, and the spores moving through the entire building. It took us $23 million in over a year to remediate that building to get them back in there. Well, the question is, in a large city today, if somebody releases anthrax spores, should they stay? Should they leave? If they leave, do they take the spores with them in their cars and their clothing? We don't know those answers yet, and we need to do much more work to address them, because tomorrow could be the day.
If you have radiological contamination in a specific area, what you want to do is ensure that those people who have contamination arrive at a point of safety where they can be decontaminated and cared for. You don't want them getting on airplanes, contaminating an airplane, and flying across the country and contaminating areas and their families when they get there. So there will be efforts to contain the transmittable or transportable hazard, and that's only responsible. It's been done throughout history. When you go back to some of the major pandemics where they tried to quarantine communities, and that's almost out of sight, out of mind, too hard for the nation. But I will tell you, there are people who are looking at this. They're writing plans for how we would go about it.
And these challenges are all exacerbated by the fact that so many of us live so close together in our cities. That means that you're very dependent on the infrastructure. The average city has 3 days of food in the city. If the trucks don't run, the food is gone in 3 days. The average person doesn't even have 3 days of food in their house. In New York City, I understand some people shop between meals. They'll shop for lunch and then they shop again for dinner in the evening, because there's a mom and pop shop just around the corner that they like to go to. And of course, the closer we are together, the more regulations there has to be to regulate our lives so that we don't impact on the lives and freedoms of others. And also, the closer together we are, the better the little microbes like it that bring disease to us, because it's easier for them to move from one of us to another. And so there are lots of problems that are exacerbated because we have so many of our people living in our cities.
So I believe that we have a challenge in this country in the citizens being able to intelligently address their responsibility in a high-risk area. And we have millions and millions and millions of people living in a high-risk area that are sitting with 1 or 2 days of food in their house, no water because the tap runs, and haven't got a clue what they're going to do when power goes down and the water quits running and the toilets quit flushing and the grocery store isn't open. That to me is a responsibility of the citizen, every citizen who lives in a high-risk area. They should be able to take care of it. It's kind of Maslow's hierarchy of need, and I may be bruising some psychologists with this, but you know, frankly, if you can't take care of yourself, you can't take care of anybody else. The first thing you have to be able to say, I can take care of myself. I got a plan, I have resources, I know what I'm going to do. If I say that, the husband or wife can say, I can now take care of my family. And if you can take care of your family, you have a potential of helping your neighbor. Short of that, you become part of the problem.
In the age we live in, it is not unreasonable for individual families to have a sort of disaster plan. It might be because you're worried about extreme weather, tornadoes, depending on where you live, the earthquake, or it might be because you're concerned about an anthrax situation, or you're concerned about a chemical situation of some kind, or even a nuclear situation. So the kind of preparedness we heard about a few years ago in the wake of 9/11 is, I think, a responsible thing for a family to think about.
Back in the old Cold War, we learned in school to hide under our desk, say our prayers quickly. What a citizen can do about this, it can maybe divide it into a couple of levels. I mean, at the individual level or family level, people should have their own preparedness program to take care of their family against various emergencies, including terrorism.
The more educated I think the public is, the better off we are without creating a situation of panic that can produce all kinds of unnecessary, unwelcome political responses more broadly in our democracy. So you don't want to do that. But I think a sensible approach to catastrophic events and how a family deals with them is certainly a reasonable thing to do.
No family should be without water for 72 hours for every individual in the family without using 7-Eleven or other, because there are various things from earthquakes and tornadoes to a terrorist attack that could impact on a family's ability to survive.
In an emergency like that, the less people are dependent on the system, the stronger we will be. If everybody had enough food and enough water and could keep themselves warm, there wouldn't be any panic, would there?
Given that there is likely to be, if not some disruption, at least some diminution of supply chains for everything, for food and medicines and other things we depend upon, to think about some reasonable level for you of a home stockpile. Make sure you've got some given that there is likely to be, if not some disruption, at least some diminution of supply chains for everything, for food and medicines and other things we depend upon, to think about some reasonable level for you of a home stockpile. Make sure you've got some supply of foods, some water, the medicines you need.
There's a lot of transmitted information in hurricane-prone areas and earthquake-prone areas that basically say you should certainly have the ability to take care of yourself for 7 days. You should have enough water and enough food to do that. I think that, personally, that's woefully inadequate. I think that people need to be able to understand how they're going to take care of themselves for months. 4 months. Not days, but months. And not be standing out in front of their house or what's left of it saying, where's the federal government? I've got my rights. Where are people coming to take care of me? They become the problem.
Years ago, Howard Ruff was a counselor for financial things, and he had made some predictions about the stock market, which turned out to be remarkably correct. So he was an icon for a while. He had a TV show, I think he called it Rough House, and he had a newsletter, he called it Rough Times. And people would come to him for advice on how to invest their money, and he would say, do you have a year's supply of food for your family? They'd say, no. Well, he said, that's the most important investment you can make. You don't have any money to invest anywhere else until you have a year's supply of food for your family. So you go buy the year's supply of food for your family and come back, and then we'll talk about what to do with the rest of your money, because you don't have any money to invest until you've bought a year's supply of food for your family. So they'd do that and come back, and then he'd say, have your food? Yes, we do. Well, do you have a bag of silver? Now, a bag of silver is $1,000 face value of junk silver, the old silver dimes and quarters and half dollars and so forth. And of course, almost none of them did. Well, he said, that's the second most important investment you make. Something you can bargain with. Now, if you were really independent, you wouldn't need that. But his first counsel was absolutely essential. If you don't have any money to invest in anything else until you have some supply of food. For him, it was a year's supply. Now, it's of interest that he was a Mormon, and of course they all do that. But this is great advice for anybody. And maybe you can't buy your supply of food. And all the Lord expects you to do is what you can do. I visited Russia a number of times, and everybody in Russia has a dacha. And the citizens of the United States need to look at that and why they do it. And they do it because they just don't trust the system. Whether you're rich or you're poor, you have a garden. And if you're poor, well, you have a little shed, not much bigger than an outhouse, that you have your garden tools. And if you're rich, it's a nice summer home. But everybody there, essentially everybody there, has a dacha, and they raise their food, they pickle it. You don't freeze it, by the way. Electricity may go off, and then you won't have it. Can it and pickle it and put it in a root cellar and dry it and so forth. They use various technology for saving their food. But they all have experience that we have never had in our country.
If we imagine, God forbid, one bomb in one city and maybe there's a second bomb in another city, and you try to say, well, how will people feel about cities relative to the countryside? I would say the countryside will become a lot more attractive.
You know, the more remote you are, the less you're going to be affected by any of these things. I was amazed that during World War II, I think it was, there were people who lived in Appalachia who didn't even know we had a war. If you didn't have television and radio and you were living in the mountains there, how would you know? And that's just an example of how immune you are to these vicissitudes of society when you are more and more remote.
But if you have the ability, and you're in a very high threat area, and it becomes a point where every time you drive across the bridge into that metropolitan area that may or may not have been attacked by a terrorist event, and it becomes a point where it is weighing on you, and that you do not believe that you can, even with due diligence, develop a set of circumstances that will assure safety for your family, maybe you should try to look at relocation.
Well, if I knew in 3 months we were going to have, a major crisis, economic crisis, political crisis, obviously I want to live in a rural area. I don't want to live in the center of a big metropolitan area. And even today there are the shortcomings because there's more crime there. Because you have to depend on the police and you're not allowed to own a gun. But if you live in a rural area, I know in Texas, people don't have any policemen to protect them. They have the Second Amendment. They all have a gun in the house. Where they have no protection, they're the safest. There are no policemen marching around 90% of Texas, but everybody feels that much safer.
When I think about this, I think about Thomas Jefferson, one of my favorite founding fathers, about his vision for his country. He said that he wanted his new home to be largely an agrarian society with only enough cities to provide the manufacturing necessary to support agriculture, because he didn't want his new home blighted by the decadence of cities, as was the case in the countries that we came from here. Oh, what would he say if he could be resurrected and see us today, where most of our people live in cities?
And we bought property that is in a rural area. We built a home that is self-sustaining. We can live offline if we have to. We have 3 different ways to heat our home, principally wood. We have backup power systems that allow us to run propane furnaces, thousands of gallons of propane stored, with years' supply of food. We will look in the mirror at night and say our probability of our area being impacted through natural disasters, terrorist events, or whatever is extremely low. We can take care of ourselves, and we are in a position where we can probably become part of a solution for our friends or neighbors. That's something that does not happen overnight. You have to believe that there's a probability of impact to your family. But it's nice living in a community where people are predominantly self-sufficient and that are relatively independent, and when something goes wrong, they don't go running to the government and saying, where's the government and why aren't they solving my problems for them? It just takes a plan.
We have a little place in the mountains of West Virginia, and we go there for a weekend now and then. And it's always interesting. I have no television, and you can't really get radio down there very well. Very few signals down there. We just don't turn it on. I enjoy being isolated. And I ask myself, if the world fell apart, I wouldn't know it here, would I? The sun comes up and the plants grow and the sun goes down, and if the world came unglued and fell apart, I really wouldn't know it.
We were living on the Kitsap Peninsula that had basically two ways in and out. One was ferry boat, and the other was a 4-lane bridge.
The Narrows Bridge would take you out of where we were at, but over it back into a city. And the only other way would be a ferry boat and a 2-lane highway, Highway 3, out.
And it became very obvious to my wife and I that if there was a major disaster, an earthquake or perhaps a military attack, we were living in an area that had a nuclear subbase, that had a naval shipyard.
We have the ferry boats, which was really a lovely sight with the Olympic Mountains behind it. And then over the last few years, you had the boats with the machine guns going by, which distracted from the beauty.
We were kind of at ground zero for a potential attack, at least a big attack. Realized that in about 5 minutes the ferry boats would be either filled to capacity, or there'd be such mayhem at the ferry terminals that people wouldn't be getting on or off. And the same with the bridge too. In essence, we would be stuck where we were at.
So that was kind of an issue for us, is what would we do? And how would they get food in if there was a problem?
Power would be down, and in short order, we would just be helpless refugees. It just made sense to us to move to the country where we would be in a position where we could help refugees rather than being one of them. My kids at night, in their prayers, they pray for safety. And I've never really felt that we were in an unsafe environment. So it was a little bit shocking that this should be a repeated prayer request. But then again, I think maybe they were pretty wise for their years.
I think it's very clear from the Bible that there are going to be some very major things happening quite soon, I think, that will make it quite to our advantage to be living in a country setting.
There were two things, and that would be, first was family camps that we started going to 10 years ago, where we saw and heard families who had moved to the country from the city, and observing their children and their youth and how nice they were.
Thanks to friends that we've known for some time, they had kind of acquainted us with some people and some literature that talked about life in the country.
A few years ago, we went to Out of the Cities rally in Portland, Oregon, and we had been looking casually for property before, but after Out of the Cities rallies, a few years ago, we went to Out of the Cities rally in Portland, Oregon, and we had been looking casually for property before, but after Out of the Cities rally, we really seriously looked for property.
We were looking for a parcel of property that was going to allow us to be able to grow our own food, that was going to be able to afford us a wood supply for heat, have water available for drinking as well as irrigation. And we were also looking for something that was going to be secluded.
A number of acres we wanted. We wanted 20, 40 acres. We wanted south-facing, we wanted water, and we wanted trees. And the property we got wasn't even for sale when we found this piece of property. We were looking about 60 acres over and came across this one. And we have a pond up above us, and we were looking for those kinds of things, and quiet, and not a lot of neighbors around.
For a place that was going to be quiet, that would have natural beauty. That was very important, because the Lord speaks to us through nature, and it just was very important for us to have something that made us feel calm, kind of the serenity that one gets when just being out in the great out of doors.
Our parents started talking about the idea of moving to the country. We had heard it before from different people about how moving to the country is a good thing. But since we were comfortable where we lived, I guess I can say, it was home, we were familiar with the things around us. It was sort of a sad thought to actually have to leave the things that we loved. I wasn't too excited about it. We knew that we needed to move, so it was our decision too.
I think the things that seemed exciting about it was just the whole idea of being able to get closer to living off of the land sort of thing, being able to have a garden, being able to be far away from other people, having some elbow room.
The sale of our home was maybe not miraculous, but we sold after the market in Seattle had already gotten very soft, and the greater Seattle area was hit even worse. But we set our price of our home at a level that we knew we needed to be able to sell and move and be debt-free. And in fact, we told our realtor, who was maybe a little bit dubious of the level of price that we set, hey, the Lord's going to sell it. And he kind of looked at his partner like, no, we're going to sell it. But I hope that he recognizes that the Lord had a mighty hand in that, because all the other homes in our neighborhood are still for sale today, and that was 2 years ago.
It might seem like a person would be pretty bored not having all of the exciting things that you think of when you think of a city setting, but actually it's not that way at all. There's lots of other things that you can do.
Because we're out in the nature, we can go on walks. I like bird watching, so there's lots of different birds that you don't see necessarily closer to a lot of people, a lot of noises and things that you might get around cities. And so there's a lot of nature and wildlife that's fun to watch. We always have something to do. There are so many things to do here, so many more things to do. Just that there's developing the property, we've got to develop our garden, our orchard, been working on our house. Well, personally, I think the work's fun.
Being able to just hike up on the hillside and be able to look out and there's not people right next to you.
There's skiing, there's obviously horseback riding, there's rafting, river rafting, canoeing, boating, hiking, all that stuff.
I find it an adventure in growing a garden. I do like that part. The part about canning, I haven't quite got into that yet, but I know that that's something that I will enjoy when we start doing it and learning how to do that.
We have wonderful soil. We've been here now we're in our second growing season. We had a good harvest. We've got a lot to learn about gardening, but we had a very good harvest.
I like gardening, and we have a big garden and an orchard. That's fun.
A few other things I've enjoyed as well has been learning how to use the tractor that we now have. It's really cool to be able to use that piece of equipment and to learn how to make it work and do the things I want it to. It's kind of nice. If something needs to be moved, the tractor moves it. You don't have to break your back trying to work with it.
I like working with my horse because it's my hobby. It's a challenge, but it's fun.
I'm actually 85 miles away from where my home office is, and I go in once a week, but 4 days a week I'm able to work out of my home here. There's wonderful opportunities with internet. Even though we're in a remote area, we have wireless internet that allows me to be able to, in essence, be anywhere I want to around the world. I think sometimes there's a tendency to sell yourself short when people will tend to say, oh, well, that's great for you, but I can't move. My job won't allow me to move to the country. You may be surprised. Ask your boss. See if there's a possibility of doing something, telecommuting. I have a neighbor that works for a software company that's located in Illinois, and he's living here in Washington. So things can happen. The economy is difficult right now. Sometimes renting office space doesn't make near as much sense as it may have in the past. So there may be opportunities. But for others, they're going to have to retool. They're going to have to retrain. And now's the time to start. If you decide, I'm going to need to have a new education to be able to make this move, start now. Don't wait a year from now or 2 years from now. I don't know how much time we have to wait, and I think this is a time to be getting serious about positioning yourself where you're going to need to be when disasters strike.
One of my favorite things is just the quietness. The motorcycles aren't driving through. My house isn't shaking with loud music, and I love the quietness.
Well, I have kind of a ritual. I'm the first one up, and I come out and I start a fire in the fireplace right behind me. And there's a sofa, and I go to that sofa, and I get on my knees, and I talk to the Lord. And every day, it seems like I always have situations where I say, Lord, forgive me for what I've done. Lord, please direct me. It seems like I'm asking the Lord for an awful lot, but I'm so glad that He has shoulders broader than what I can burden Him with.
We have morning and evening worship, and it draws us closer to the Lord, and it gives Him the glory of who's important in our life.
Also, we dedicate one day of each week, Saturday, to being able to draw closer to God, to spend it in prayer and in communion with Him.
We keep the seventh-day Sabbath, and we give Him glory for the creation that He's given us, and it draws us closer also to Him. And we keep the commandments, and I think that our family has been blessed, and it wasn't something that happened overnight. It was just a steady growth that happened in our family, and it's been a real blessing.
It's not because you're limited in what you do or what your circumstances are. What limits you is your perception. And where we see impossibilities, God sees absolute possibilities. As an accountant, we're not exactly known for being the daredevil types. We are conservative, and we tend not to take many risks. So for an accountant to, if you will, take the plunge and move from the city to the country, when I think of that, I think, well, surely anybody can do it as well.
If we can do it, you can do it too.